Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our final panel of the afternoon. I am incredibly excited to have these three individuals speaking about a number of topics, but specifically Northern Arizona history. That is, for me, one of the areas that as we spoke about last panel, that really needs some attention and some work here in Arizona when it comes to understanding the contributions of Black and African American people in Northern Arizona. So I'm very, very excited to have these panelists here today to talk about that and talk about just the rich history that Northern Arizona has. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass this over, and I'll have each of you introduce yourselves, and then we'll go from there. So please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Tadzia Dennis, Assistant Dean for General Education with Arizona College of Nursing and owner of Taz & Co. Consulting.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Anthony Pratcher. I'm an assistant professor of African American Studies in the Ethnic Studies program at Northern Arizona University.
Hello, my name is Greg McAllister, and I'm a teaching professor in the Ethnic Studies program at Northern Arizona University. I teach race and film, introduction to ethnic studies, as well as an introduction to African American studies. And the reason why I'm here really is to connect more with Black Arizona, the history of Arizona. My particular research focuses on Southwest Colorado, Buffalo Soldiers, and some of the problematic nature of that. And yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to read just a tiny portion of what Dr. Pratcher submitted for this panel. So just to provide a little bit of context for their discussion today. African American scholarship has long been overlooked in the Southwest. This makes it difficult to interweave local histories with the broader contours of national narratives on Black history. While there has been an outpouring of new archival collections focusing on metropolitan Phoenix, other regions, particularly Northern Arizona, has not been cataloged with the same vigor. In Phoenix, scholars have shared primary source collections via community-based courses or public history demonstrations. In Northern Arizona, teaching about local Black history is difficult due to the dearth of archival materials. This, however, is a disservice to the history of the state. African Americans were both workers and landowners in Northern Arizona from the late 19th century and were integral in the development of railroads, timber, and ranching industries. The I-40 corridor along the historic Route 66 is a rich vein of African American history. Holbrook, Winslow, Flagstaff, and Williams have long had African American populations, yet the erosion of these communities has rendered Black history invisible in this region. This panel explores how connection between local preservationists, educators, and civic activists within this community in Northern Arizona. Sorry, Anthony. These agents have proven willing to tell the stories. Panels explore how we can share their story. Sorry, Anthony. I'm really terrible at reading people's handwriting.
Sometimes I'm terrible at writing.
So this just provides a little bit of context, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to the panelists.
Well, good afternoon again. I am here as a panelist representing Flagstaff, Arizona. I am fourth generation Flagstaff. My grandfather, great-grandfather was recruited by the Forest Service along with a lot of Blacks. We were from Louisiana, Rochelle, Louisiana originally, which is no longer a city. But he was recruited to come to Flagstaff and to work for the Forest Service. And that's how we ended up there. I was not born in Flagstaff. My father was military and fell in love with my mom, who was from Flagstaff, and decided to retire because I'm the youngest of three. And I made it there permanently when I was in the third grade. If you know how Flagstaff is built, there's a railroad that goes down the center of the city. That railroad is very purposeful, not only because of the Forest Service and being able to transport and move trees where they needed to go, but a lot of it, from what I understand, and these gentlemen may have different information, but from what I was raised and being told is that it's also served a couple of sinister purposes. I used to be very close to a Navajo medicine man who was one of my great friends, who has since passed away. But he was one of the children who was sent on that railroad to California to eliminate his savage ways. So if you remember history and story of that, the Navajo Nation and Hopi Nations are there. They're border towns to Flagstaff. The Hopi Nation sits in the middle of the Navajo Nation. And there was a lot of conflict, but our white counterparts felt like they needed to be trained, they needed to be taught in white man ways. And so they were taken from their reservation land and sent to California. The other reason that the railroad is the way the train tracks are where they are is because it splits the city. So the Caucasian white part of the city is supposed to live north of the tracks, and the Blacks and Latinas are to live on the south side of the tracks. When I grew up, because my dad was military, my mom was management for schools, some of the schools there, I had an opportunity to live on the north side of the tracks. So I lived in two communities, upper middle class communities, and I was the only Black face there, the only Black family in those communities. I went to Sechrist Elementary School. I was the only Black person at that elementary school entirely. There were no janitors, no nurses, no teachers, no one but me. And I stayed there until I was in the 6th grade. The rest of my family, which all of us were there in Flagstaff. As a matter of fact, there's only 5 of us who haven't graduated from Flagstaff High School. My grandmother and everybody lived on the south side of the tracks. And so I got to visit, but I didn't live there. I did not join everyone else until junior high school, where we came together. All sides came together, and we were, going to school, junior high and high school. South side was the village, and we talk about the village often, but it was the quintessential village. It was, our elders were there. And true to life, if I got in trouble one house, I got in trouble at 5 different houses because our elders were in full effect. I knew everybody. I talked to everybody. We all grew up together. There was a little store there I used to go when I was 15, and I could buy my grandma cigarettes and beer at 15 because they knew who my grandma was, Sister Coleman. They knew who she was. We were members of the Coleman family. There was 2 Coleman families that were there. But because of our history and how long we have been there, we were very, very well known. So it was one of the greatest environments to grow up in, even though I kind of suffered from identity crisis because I wasn't white enough to be with my white friends and wasn't Black enough to be with my Black friends. My dad was owner of the only office supply store in Flagstaff. And so, I had an opportunity to have super great things and super nice things. And that's why we lived where we lived. But I loved being at my grandma's house, who lived in project housing on the south side. She lived in Brandon Homes, as well as other members of my family who lived there. So I used to live not too far away from junior high, about a mile away from junior high school. And I can remember times when there was no bus. So if it's a mile, less than a mile or a mile, they wouldn't take you home. You'd have to walk home. But I'd catch the bus and go to my grandma's house and get in trouble, risk getting in trouble because I didn't go home and just go hang out at my grandma's house to be with everybody else that I knew, and all the Black kids that were there and all the Hispanic kids that were there. My Native brothers and sisters, very big Native population. And that's what I know. But like I said, it was a lot for me. It's a tremendous city. It's still very much built that way. If you know some of the inner workings of Flagstaff, there's an Elks Lodge on the north side of the tracks, which is the White Elks, as we used to call it. And then there used to be a Black Elks on San Francisco Street. My family's church was Harbor Chapel Church. There's 4 different Black churches that are all on the south side. When I came in, there was conversation about Dunbar, and I think it's the Dunbar in Phoenix. However, there was a Dunbar Elementary School in Flagstaff that my mother attended before they closed it, and everybody went to South Beaver Elementary School in Kinsey after that. So it is my life. I miss it. I left because I was over the snow. Yeah, I left in 2011 and 2010 we had over 100 inches of snow. Roofs were caving in. It was craziness. As a kid growing up in the snow, it was 3 or 4 days we were out of school because we had feet of snow. It wasn't inches, it was feet. How many feet are we going to get this time? But it's one of the most beautiful communities. The Grand Canyon is my backyard and one of the most beautiful places ever. There's a heavy presence. There was a heavy presence of Black families there a period of time. And that's when I talk about the village. Even my mother being raised there, there was a heavy presence of us. And just because the economy has changed, it was always an expensive place to live. But now it's just outpriced a whole bunch of people, and we all just left and went other places. Fortunately, though, some of us are moving back and reclaiming our space back in Flagstaff. So that's my story. Okay.
Sweet. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks you so much again as to the Black collections here at ASU. So thank you, Jess and Nancy. Thank you to Community Driven Archives Initiative. The work that they do, I cannot support it enough. Much of my research wouldn't be possible without it. So anytime they ask me to show up, I'm going to come and try to have something for them. What I'm going to talk about today is not so much history. We're not necessarily going to roll up our sleeves and get in the archival material. It's not going to be that today. It's more of outlining a way of thinking about what it means to teach Black history in a place like the Plateau. The primary thing that I've realized in the time that I've been up there is that there's this real intense need for connection. Like, you've got to figure out how to make this specific thing, the specific idea, something that the students can connect to. Because as Dr. Dennis was saying, the isolation up there is real. A lot of the students are isolated from or when I'm talking about students, the students of color, the Black students, are isolated in many ways from the broader community. And they're trying to figure out how to navigate a space, a predominantly white space that may have a different set of understanding or a different way of interpreting what Black history means than one that's going to instill them with pride. So part of what you've got to do is figure out how to get them to connect the fact that learning about this is something that matters for them, and not just the Black students, all of the students, because the way that we have it up there is that our ethnic studies courses are part of a graduation requirement. So the question is always, why do I have to learn this? Why is it that you're making me learn things like this? So one of the ways I try to get students to engage with that question is by, and this is what this talk was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about this really great idea I had where we did a public history walk. It was going to be really amazing. The issues I offered as extra credit. And so like 5% of the class showed up. So, God bless them. They show up when they are obliged to be there. But one of the great things I think about Flag, and one of the things that I've had to consider about how to teach there, is what it means to teach the students about the history of a community that we see actively disappearing before our eyes. So this picture right here is a picture of the South Side mural. This is in an alleyway on the south side of Flagstaff. It's a mural that reflects the history of the community, the Black history in this community. It's done by a local artist, Chip Thomas. And what you can see here are pictures. I mean, I love this mural, really, because you see these pictures of kids, of families. You see the richness of the community that existed up there, of the Black community. And it's so interesting, because this mural is about maybe 300 yards from the north edge of NAU's campus. So there's this way that on the south side of Flagstaff, it's difficult to see it because, as I said, it's actively being removed and erased. But there's this rich history, a very intertwined history between Northern Arizona University and the Black communities surrounding it. The question is, how do you get students to see these connections? How do you get them to see that they're part of a history that they otherwise may not see? So to tell you how I think you have to do this, I want to start by coming back down to the Valley. One of the students who did not show up to the history walk told me about a teacher in Tempe Union High School District, Natasha Alston. So Natasha Alston is one of the only teachers in the state at the K-12 level that teaches Black history. She has an African-American studies course. I believe she's beginning to pilot out a sort of African-American or the African-American AP history program. I think that's what's supposed to be something coming on in the future. I read about this in the Republic, but the reason I bring this up is because when we get up to Flagstaff, right, one of her students says to me, you know, Professor Pratcher, do you know so-and-so? I have no idea, you know, who this teacher is. I wish I had, you know, but I think it's part of the point that, and also real quick, I want to bring this up. We have to consider what Mountain Point is. This is where she teaches at Mountain Point. Mountain Point being in Tempe Union High School District. Tempe Union, they hire some of their first Black faculty out of ASU in the late 50s and early 60s. And they have a long legacy, honestly, of empowering Black administrators to try to build curriculum, to support culture, to engage with community, to really become part of the Tempe, to become part of the city of Tempe, part of what can be offered here, thinking of Tempe as a diverse place. So this is a way of thinking at the district level that even makes it possible for someone like this to exist in the classroom. There were a couple of quotes from Miss Alston. And while she's in Tempe, I think, as I said, this is so important because the stuff that she's teaching down here is part of what I'm trying to help replicate up in Flagstaff. There's a line from her article, the one about her that says, where she talks to the students, she says, know that your Blackness doesn't need to look like what you see in social media and on TV. Maybe some of you guys want to become cowboys. There's still Black cowboys today. Black Americans are as vast a culture as any out there. And this is, so what I think you wind up seeing in her class is what I would like to call the, it's okay, it's gonna come along. The 5 C's of teaching Black history in Northern Arizona. So we all know the 5 C's, right? Does anyone know what are the 5 C's of Arizona? Five stars. Very good. Very good. Okay. So for Flagstaff, for teaching in Northern Arizona, what I've really come to conclude is that there's particular places we have to have an emphasis. That's in curriculum, that's in culture, community, and I'm calling this the last one coordinates. And there's a 5th one that I'm going to keep a little secret for a while. But the point more so is if we look culture, or if we look at curriculum, I think is the place to really start. What we wind up seeing is that the work of someone like Alston, what she's doing is laying out a framework for the rest of us across the state to think about how we can teach local Black history. So first off, there's the curriculum that I use. I teach my class using the Revisioning America series from Beacon Press. And one of the great things about this series is that it focuses in an intersectional sort of way on the histories of communities of color, of marginalized communities in the United States, and tells the story of the US from the perspective of those communities. In my class this semester, we're using all 3 of these texts: a Black woman's history of the United States, an African-American and Latinx history of the United States, and an Afro-Indigenous history of the United States, and going through each week chapter by chapter to try to look at the different intersectional ways in which African Americans can be represented in American history. So looking at this from the perspective of Black women. So looking at it from the perspective of Black workers in the Latinx book. Looking at this, looking at our history from the perspective of Afro-Indigenous people. And what you wind up seeing with this particular approach, one, are similarities, but 2, also the ways in which our communities intersect. On the Plateau, there is a relatively large Afro-Indigenous population. We have Afro-Indigenous students, and one of the ways that we can really engage them is by trying to have materials in the classroom that reflects their communities. One of the great things about this series in particular is that the stories that it tells are generally stories you would not hear in American history. It's a very sort of from the ground up type of series, but this is integral to teaching Black history in the state. Because part of what it is that we've got to get students to see is, as Ms. Alston said, you could be a cowboy, you could be this, you could be that, you could be any type of role historical role that's already been played out here. And the point is there's already so many different roles, so many different types of people. Real quick, I'm going to get back to this next point about the types of people, the types of historical actors we have. But the other thing that I've really focused on a lot is culture. And so culture takes place in a couple of ways. One, culture is national. So there's a sort of national meta culture of African-American studies that the students have like a quotidian understanding with, in the sense of like, this is, and maybe not this is just what I'm teaching because I like hip hop. So I wanted to teach hip hop this year. But the point was to give them something that was like not academic, something that was familiar, something they'd hear on the radio, something they'd see on the streets. Another example through music. So thinking of Michael Jackson. So Michael Jackson's grandfather actually, I believe, lived in Holbrook. It was either Holbrook or Winslow. I can't remember which one it was, but he lives on the I-40 corridor. And so you start the class with the Michael Jackson song and you ask the students, like, what's the connection? What's the connection? They don't know. They just know who Michael Jackson is. And then you leave them with this little nugget that eventually is something that winds up sticking with them. So part of the idea is figuring out how to use culture, something that they're already engaging with, to help them see the connection of Black Arizonans to Northern Arizona. Okay, so going back to this idea of people, in the Valley, one of the things that you see a lot of, thank you. This is a video, it's a TikTok actually about Mary Green and Helen K. Mason. And one of the reasons I want to include this particular clip is because of the way it exists as a social media piece, right? So the thing I've been trying to get my students to see is that history is not necessarily something that's just in the classroom. It's not just in a book. It's something that you can find online. It's something that exists around you. And so part of the project, part of the idea of the mural tour that I was taking them on, the walking tour that I sort of started this conversation out with, was to have them produce some type of very short social media input, you know, if that in that sort of sense, like they need to have an assignment where they're creating something. But the point is to start creating materials that reflect the archive we want to see created, because the stories are there. The stories are there. It's just a question of how can the students go and recover them. So one of the ways of doing that really is by going out in the community and looking to see what people are already making. So one of the other things that we're planning on doing, and Lord forgive, Dr. George Brooks, he's renowned throughout the state for his work in aquaculture. He's coming up to give a guest lecture on aquaculture in South Phoenix for the students in Flagstaff. And so in one way, it's like, how is this teaching people about Black history in Northern Arizona? I think it's important to remember that the I-17 is also a corridor. And that if we go back to Wilson Riles, the first Black graduate of NAU, what you wind up seeing is that if along the 66 corridor, people are constantly going back and forth between Flagstaff, Williams, Holbrook, and Phoenix. And so it's the connection between the entire state that makes it so that we can have community representatives, not just from Flagstaff. We also met with Deb Harris, a former dean at NAU and a councilwoman on the Flagstaff City Council. We went over to the Murdoch Center and we chatted with her about the history of the Murdoch Community Center. It used to be, if I'm not mistaken, a school that was turned into a community center for residents, Black residents in Flagstaff. So one of the things that we're trying to do is figure out how to get students to see that history isn't, as I said, just something that they're reading in a book, or it's not just something that's happening somewhere else, but it's happening to the people that are around them. It's happening to the people who are in their community. It's happening to the neighbors that even them there as students, if they don't see these people as their neighbors, like these are still people who are close enough for us to go and touch. And then more importantly, in that sort of sense, it's showing the way in which our community is not just in that area, but it's across the entire state. So that's part of, that's part of the thing that we're trying to figure out how to bring together by having people from outside the classroom come and join us. And then finally, okay, I'm calling it coordinates. Once again, another map of Phoenix. And this is because I don't have a map of Flagstaff, but there's a need to do things such as these walking tours. There's a need to go and identify spaces that are associated with Black history, because it's the loss of them is really imaginary. If you think of it this way, it's like when we go and we look at historic buildings, the value of the building is not necessarily in the structure itself. Lord, forgive me if I say anything to cross historic preservationist, but really it's in the idea of how we make sense of that place. And so one of the things that we need to do is send students out into the community, out into the actual world, so that they can have an opportunity to see with their own eyes the places where African Americans have been living, even if they're not there today. And so this, another one of the murals in Flagstaff, this is a picture of it, sort of is the, how would I say it? It's the epitome, I think, of the broader pedagogy, which is really how do you develop a curriculum that shows students Black culture by putting them out in the community in places where they may not, necessarily see it. And the idea behind all of this effectively is how can we create a connection between students, as I said, between their local histories and a sort of national narrative? How do you create a connection between students who are going to Flagstaff to visit a place that they may not see as being their community, but understanding how all of us here as Arizonans, as Black Arizonans, have a history that's intertwined together. And so what I will end with is sort of the idea of if we're going to have this type of connection, if we're going to encourage this type of connection with our students, it's important for us as historical professionals to figure out some type of statewide apparatus to help connect us. I know that Margaret has her own strategies. I'm all on board with this. I just got to put out a plug for ASALH. ASALH is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. It's a Carter G. Woodson association. So in that sense, these are the folks who invented Black History Month. But the wonderful thing of this association is that they have branches across the country, right? And so it's a national association with local branches. In a similar way, in this state, we need a statewide sort of association that can bring all these disparate communities together in Northern Arizona and Southern Arizona and Central Arizona so that we can have these types of discussions regularly and help each other take this information back to the communities that we're working with. The issue with teaching Black history in Northern Arizona, I would argue, is that you're up there doing it by yourself or really with one other colleague in this sort of sense. But by figuring out how to develop a statewide organization, we can create the connections that allow us to focus on all the other aspects of how we get this information out there. That's my presentation. Thank you all for your time. And I'm going to turn it over to my main man over here.
Oh. So we can take it. Yeah, let's see. Keep going. Keep going down. Right here. Yeah. Okay. So I feel slightly outside here because my research focuses on John Taylor. And my master thesis was called John Taylor and the Formation of Race on the Ute Borderlands. Okay. Oh, okay. Right here? Okay. Yeah, because okay. Okay. Is this better? Okay.
I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Because I like to see everybody. Okay. So I'm going to give you the quick story about John Taylor. And then I want to go into some details. But, really, this is like between an hour and 45-minute lecture. Well, I'm going to cut it down short. Okay. So John Taylor was an African. Okay. He was enslaved as a child, brought over from Africa. This is according to his family, the family oral history of his Southern Ute relatives. Okay. This was passed down. I mean, there was a conversation earlier about Black people not necessarily talking about slavery. Well, in the case of John Taylor's family, he shared the story about coming over on a boat, being sold as a child, seeing the members of his family being sold. Okay, so this is part of that oral history. So one of the important pieces, though, in terms of John Taylor's story and how it relates to Arizona and even Black identity in the Southwest borderlands, is John Taylor claims to be the first white man to settle Southwest Colorado. Okay. Now, John Taylor is not passing as white. He's not a light-skinned African American. In fact, there's the image here in the middle. Very dark black man, claiming to be the first white man in Southwest Colorado. Okay. And John Taylor was so firm in this that he actually trained the white folks in that area to also acknowledge. All right. So it's not like he's just out of his mind. All right. But I would argue that there's a regional context to his whiteness. Okay, if we can go to the next one. Okay. Okay, so here's a photograph of him in the Trading Post. Yeah, let's go on to the next one. Because I really wanted, this is members of his family. You can go on, keep going. Okay, more the Southern youths of African ancestry, keep going. Okay, so here's his odyssey. You know, he comes from Africa, ends up in, you know, Georgia, Kentucky. He fights in the Civil War. He becomes a Buffalo Soldier. He comes out west, you know, New Mexico, Arizona. And then once he's discharged, he lives this nomadic life where he, you know, he intermarries with the Apache, the Navajo. In fact, in one article that was published by a man that had interviewed John Taylor, he accurately describes the Navajo divorce, you know, where his stuff is thrown outside the hogan. Okay, similar Apache and Navajo divorce, you know, your stuff is taken out. So it's interesting, you know, so if you look at the dates here, so 1867 comes out to New Mexico. He's discharged in 1870, and then he has this nomadic life between 1870 and 1878. And then he ends up as an interpreter, fluent in Spanish, fluent in Navajo, fluent in Apache, and fluent in Ute, right? So he's an interpreter for treaties. I mean, this is amazing. I mean, I consider myself fluent in Spanish as long as I stay in the present tense, you know? But yeah, this guy's incredible. Okay, so, okay, if we can go to the next one. Okay, here's another picture of John Taylor. Next one. Okay, so I want to go to his unusual claim. All right. So the first quote, I want to give you the context of this. This is the 1920s in Southwest Colorado. You have a Ku Klux Klan that's very active. You have, you know, people outside of, you know, people from Texas in Colorado. And the story goes that John Taylor had a farm, you know, in Ignacio. And he would go into Bayfield, Colorado to get supplies for his farm. And back in the day, you know, usually if you were to go to a store, there would be a clerk, right? And people would stand in line and get served. Well, the story goes that John Taylor, you know, waited in line until he was in the front of the line. And there were some folks that didn't know him. And they said, who are you to be acting like a white person? Because back in the day, you know, black people had to wait until there was no one else, right? Until all the white folks were served and there were no white people behind you. So he says this, you know, so again, he's being agitated, right? By some, you know, white boys, maybe they're, you know, Klan members. So he says to them, white ain't just on the outside. On the inside, I am as white as you. This must have shocked them. Now, not only does this happen, okay, there are other white folks that know John Taylor. They said, that's right. He's one of us. So this is an example of how, John Taylor claimed to be white, and there were people that supported him in what I call his unusual claim. There's another event that's documented in which John Taylor shows up at an annual, settler reunion. So if you're thinking 1920s, you had a bunch of old farts talking about the old days, the good old days, right? And John Taylor, now just imagine this, and this is the convention. You're all old settlers, and he opens the event by saying, "Yes, sir, I was the first white man, to settle, the Pine River Valley," and then all the other folks say, "Yes, right." Okay. So John Taylor at this point, even though we don't know exactly his age, right? Because most people that were enslaved, they didn't know that, they didn't have their age. But I would say most likely in his 70s, 80s. So it could be that, he's senile, right? That, he's losing his mind, saying that he's a white man. What I argue in my thesis is that there's two things that are happening here. One is, if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so one thing is that when you had Black people coming out west from the east, there's a different racial dynamic that's happening here, okay? So here's a quote from Quintard Taylor, no relation. He says, "There's a striking ambiguity about race in the West. Much of it stems from the presence of four groups of color. Indeed, the concept of race as generally advanced in the South and the East has undergone reinterpretation and redefinition precisely because of the presence of a variety of racial groups." Okay, and then there's another quote here. "Part of what made the West the land of opportunity was the chance to become white." So in a sense, this whiteness is coming from the settler state, okay? Next. Okay, now what I want to show, though, is that in a sense, this whiteness is connected with Blacks being settlers, non-indigenous, okay? There are other examples of quote unquote white Black people. John Baptiste de Sable, founder of Chicago, first white settler. There's some, and also you have George Bonga. There's one book that says, "In giving the early history of Chicago, the Indians say with great simplicity, the first white man who settled here was a Negro." Okay. George Bonga. Now, this is a very dark Black man, right? Can we agree on that? Yes. Here he says, "I assure you, that I was the first, one of the first two of white folks." So let me ask you, what's going on here? What do you think is going on here? Anyone? These guys are just out of their minds, or what?
I keep thinking that maybe it's just about values. They're bringing white values into an indigenous culture.
Okay. Okay. So there's the cultural piece. Okay, if we can go to the next one, next slide. So even here in the Southwest, it says the Pueblo Indians often say the first white man our people saw was a Black man. So this is how it relates to Arizona. Okay, so this is where it connects with Arizona history. So if you think about, where does Black Arizona history begin, or when does it begin, right? We have to begin with the Spaniards. Next. So what I did, because I was encouraged by my professors of indigenous studies to begin to look at indigenous perspectives on these things, right? So what I did, and I consider this a very superficial research, I started looking at indigenous dictionaries, all right? Because there's something is going on, right? With these different individuals, George Bonga, John Taylor, and then Mr. Sando, you know, when he wrote the history of the Pueblos. So I looked at some dictionaries. I looked at the, you know, Western Apache Dictionary, the Hopi Dictionary, the Navajo Dictionary. Now, the punchline here is that whiteness, according to this, you know, this linguistic analysis, is not based on skin color. Okay. So white people are not really white. So if you look at the, oh, what happened? Well, that's weird. Okay. Okay, so if you look at each language, there's the word for white person, right? If you're looking at the Apache one, it's connected with the English language. You look at the word for the color white, it's a different word. Okay, so this is the pattern with each language. Okay. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so if you look at the term for Negroes, it is just a black version. People that speak English, right? If you're looking at the Hopi dictionary, you know, we're black Mexicans. Okay, we're connected with Spanish. Next slide, please. So even with other groups, the Omaha, you know, they have a word for white person, wake. The term for the color white is a different word. So it's the same. So this is the pattern. Next one, please. So I definitely wanted to see what the words for black people were in the Ute language. And so in the Ute language, they have the term tu muricach. Okay, tu means black. Muricach actually comes from Spanish americano. Okay, black American. Now, what's interesting, as indigenous people are becoming assimilated, colonized, they come up with a word tu nigitsi. That N-I-G-I, guess what that comes from? Right, the N word. Yeah, yeah. So, you know, this whiteness is not necessarily stable. You know, next slide. Yeah, so there were even anthropologists that were noticing this. Herman Tenkate does a tour of native North America, and here's a quote from him. Among Indians, a white man is synonymous with an American, so they call a Negro a black white man. Okay. So I think, you know, if we're looking at this history, I think it's very important that we look at, you know, part of our struggle to be equal in the society in many ways does involve in being part of that colonial project. So I think we have to begin to, you know, come to terms with some of that, right? So black soldiers, black cops, right? You know, we want to be part of this society, but I think in terms of, as we look at history, we need to think about, okay, why is it important? And what are some of the complexities of that? Yeah, let's see the next one. Yeah, I think I just want to finish up with this. So I was part of an exhibit that's at Fort Garland in Colorado, and it's called Revision, Buffalo Soldiers Revision. And it's looking at the Buffalo Soldiers' role as, you know, individuals that came out west, you know, as soldiers. You know, they should have been in the South protecting their communities, to be honest, right? When Reconstruction failed, right? But they came out here, right? So I think it's part of that story of Black citizenship. But, you know, I guess what I'm asking in the 21st century is that we need to come to terms with some of this.
Hello, hello. Oh, excellent. Hey, I'm back. Thank you, Dr. Dennis, Dr. Pratcher, and Dr. McAllister. Really appreciate your entry into this conversation, especially about what you ended on, Dr. McAllister. I think that that was quite interesting. So do we have any questions for this panel? Oh, I see a hand.
Before I ask my question, I just wanted to share that I am a graduate of Mountain Point High School, and I was in Dr. Olson's class. I would say it was very hard to get into her class because at that time it was 2018. I graduated, and I think she started teaching that class 2014. She only had that class. She only had 2 periods for that class. And to give a little bit more background on Mountain Point High School, they took students from Maricopa and South Mountain and Levine to go to Mountain Point. And so there was a huge influx of Black Mexican students at that high school. And I would like to also thank Dr. Boyce at ASU that's also doing work with Mountain Point High School and Dr. Olson to build up that programming. But my question is, how do we get this curriculum highlighted in Arizona schools that is from K to 8 instead of just in high school? So we can spark that curiosity, that creativity before they get to college.
Thank you for that question. You know, there's what we need is when I say curriculum, like we need to come up with things that people can do both on campus and like Saturday school, at home, so on and so forth. So one of the things that I've noticed, if you look at the stuff that's going on in grassroots bookstores, as an example, they have a lot of self-published books. There's a lot of really interesting stuff I think that we could do as far as children's books go. There are a lot of local luminaries who, if there was to be some type of like small sort of historical text on them, something with pictures that kids could be able to get to, I think that might be a way to help. There's also the ability to develop textbooks. That's something that has been brought to my attention recently. There's some publishers out there, like Kindle Hunt is, I think, the best example of this, and they may focus on college level material. But what you can do is you can effectively come up with like a classroom reader that will allow you to come up with the curriculum for a particular course. They'll publish the textbook for you. And so if you think of the way that the sort of I'm not deep in the homeschooling game like that, in the charter game, so I can't speak on it, but it's more so that you can eventually wind up using the ESA money as an example to pay for the curricular materials that you need. So I think this is why I keep going back to the idea of there being a need for some type of central organization to begin to develop this type of intellectual property, essentially, because the question is political of how to make an intervention at an earlier level. But that's why there needs to be some type of organization that has the clout to help disseminate that information across the state so that we can all start working together towards an end such as that.
I think you have to also, if I can interject, you administratively, you've got to identify the need. You have to identify an overwhelming need for something like this. And so using data and information is what the state's going to look at to say, hey, we need this. And, you know, the organization that, you know, helps to identify that need is where you're going to have to start. You're going to have to make it so in their face that and identify why it needs to be there for them to consider and for them to think of adding it and doing something in the curriculum for it.
I just want to plug also that Community Driven Archives is very active in the K through 12 space. Our colleague Jasmine Torres is currently piloting a program called CDA Escalator or Little School that is very dedicated to coming into K through 12 schooling in order to speak about community-driven archival praxis and theory and how that can be incorporated into classroom instruction or other ways in which we can expose especially BIPOC students to how to preserve their memory and history through very friendly means. If you know of a school district that really could use CDA theory practice and CDA Little School, please reach out to us because we would love to be able to have more exposure, especially into BIPOC school districts, which is the majority of the districts here, especially in Phoenix. I see a hand.
Thank you all for a really exciting panel. Yeah, a couple sort of offers and asks. One, some of the work I do here at ASU with my undergrads is having them write stuff on Wikipedia, including creating new articles that aren't there yet and ought to be there. Which seems like it might have some interesting tie-in to the work you all are doing. And so if anyone wants to talk to me about that, let me know, because it's pretty fun and rewarding, and can probably be done at the high school level too. Two, Dr. Pratcher, are you offering the mural tour again? And can we come?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I also think that's part of the when we talk about what it means to teach, we have murals down in the valley as well. They're not as easy as to walk to as it is up in Flagstaff, but it's the way in which these types of public histories are really integral to teaching, you know, a local history in a place such as Flagstaff. Without these types of representations, it'd be really difficult for the students to even be aware of what's going on around them. So things such as those walking tours, they're just helpful in helping people see what they otherwise wouldn't be able to see. That type of public art, as far as representation goes, it just makes it possible for us to teach people things that otherwise wouldn't be apparent.
Cool. Well, sign me up. And last for Dr. McAllister, could you tell us more about the Buffalo Soldier exhibit you were part of? What did it consist of? What were they trying to do?
Yeah, that's at Fort Garland. So I was a consultant with that particular project. There were a group of artists that were really re-envisioning the Buffalo Soldier experience. Fort Garland was where Kit Carson was stationed. And then also, I think prior to the Buffalo Soldier project, there was an exhibit that was looking at, you know, Hispanic, indigenous slavery in that area. And so it just, what was your question again? Sorry. Yeah. So it involved research. Actually, Chip Thomas was involved in that. Yeah, so the same person that did the mural also did that large picture of John Taylor and Dick Charlie that I was standing next to. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I highly recommend you check it out. I mean, he has a wall mural of the Buffalo Soldiers on bicycles. You know, it's just beautiful. Yeah.
I see a hand.
There's actually a video.
Oh.
Yes. Didn't you know that? Yeah. There is a video that Google Fort Garland and Dr. Chip Thomas, and it comes up and it talks about developing it. And one of the key things they were doing there was they were bringing in artists to help interpret what it was like from an artist's lens for Buffalo Soldiers to be in that landscape. They also did redo their display there at the fort, but he also, through his video, they were able to get artists to do that. We're actually doing a similar thing in Flagstaff, the Coconino Center for the Arts. One of the issues in Flagstaff and an NAU is that the NAU mascot, which is this big burly white lumberman, doesn't adequately, thank you, lumberjack, thank you, doesn't adequately represent the Black history of that area. So the Coconino Center of the Arts and Dr. Thomas is going to be the curator of the collection. We're going after funding to bring in artists to talk about this issue and how inadvertently, not intentionally, but that mascot is erasing a good chunk of what is important Northern Arizona Black history. So, but I do know, yeah, you should be able to bring up the video.
Yeah. I mean, that in itself is kind of interesting, right? Because right now, Louis the Lumberjack is a white guy, right? But I don't know if I want to see a Black I don't know if I want to see it in blackface, you know. So that's, I think I think the acknowledgement is important, but I think we need to be careful of how history is used.
I don't necessarily disagree with you, but it's still a conversation that needs to be had.
Absolutely.
How these mascots, not intentionally, but they are, you know, let's see, Brooks and I had a conversation with Robert Birch, who's part of the Sima Hadathi organization, which is basically a Black historical society and culture of Salt Lake City. And one of his statements was, one of the biggest things we have to remind people is that there are actually Black people in Utah. And Black Mormons, which by the way, has been a long history of Black Mormons. The point, and that's our presence is being erased in the West because people don't know we're here, don't know to ask the question of, were there Black lumber people? When you have this big burly white guy who represents what is thought to be the timber industry, or at least so those are the conversations and the things that we need to talk about too, because that's inadvertently how this history is being erased, basically.
Any last questions for Dr. Dennis, Dr. Pratcher, or Dr. McAllister? Tracy.
Dennis, and coming from this last comment, you said your grandfather was recruited to work in the forestry industry. Can you tell us any more about that?
It was my great grandfather, yeah, who was recruited, and there was, that was kind of the trend. That's what they did, was recruit Blacks and Hispanics, Latinx individuals to come and work the Forest Service. And so they went to the southern states, a lot of southern states, to do so. I didn't, of course, didn't know who he was. I knew of my great grandmother very well. She was very prominent in the Flagstaff community, Black part of the Flagstaff community. Where the mural is, the Murdoch Center, is actually the last remaining piece of Dunbar Elementary School, which is where my mother went to. So it's an old part. And I don't know if you do your walking tour, if you visit some of the Black churches, which are all in that kind of vicinity of each other in Flagstaff, as well as South Beaver Elementary School, which was a big part of the community as well. So it was just, that's how we ended up there. But there was a whole lot of families who ended up there for that reason, because of the recruitment.
I can say that the migration patterns largely Louisiana, Arkansas. Yeah, it was Alexandria in particular, Louisiana. I think that's one of the places that a lot of people were recruited from. So there was it's not one-to-one, but there was a migration from those lumber regions to northern Arizona in particular, because even the businesses from that part of the country, McNary Lumber being the most prominent, but they moved from southern Louisiana and from southern Arkansas, or northern Louisiana, southern Arkansas, over to northern Arizona.
Again, I want to thank Dr. Dennis, Dr. Pratcher, and Dr. McAllister. And just one last thing, I guess, on my end for this panel. Would y'all be willing to plug individual works or anything that you would like for folks to know more about, either the Northern Arizona Black history or just the work that you are doing and the scholarship that you are doing to contribute to the Black history of Arizona? I would love to hear if you all have any plugs that you would like to say to everybody.
As someone who grew up in Flagstaff, it's so important to have you gentlemen teaching at NAU. When we went to high school, the expectation was that you automatically go to NAU. So 3 of my degrees are from NAU, because that's just what you did. There was at one point in time, Klein, the library on campus, did a full study. There were some individuals who were there, and I don't know where it's at this point in time, because I left NAU some time ago. That was all about the Flagstaff community and those who were members of the Flagstaff community. So there's pictures, there's history of my family, of the families that were there, lots of old pictures, things that didn't even know existed, but I got an opportunity to see it. But I don't know what Klein has done with that information. But it's just tremendous to have you up there still teaching and to know that we have an identity. There's a lot of us who are from there. A lot of us grew up there. And we have, we have a presence. We just are not, we left for whatever reason. But like I said, fortunately, some of us are going back to make sure we represent. So thank you both.
Dr. Pratcher, do you have anything that you would like to plug?
I appreciate that, Dr. Dennis. I really do. My website is professorpratcher.com. You can keep up with whatever it is I'm doing there. Right now, I'm focusing on teaching those kids. So this is kind of like the work in progress. I'm gonna keep, baking the notes or whatever. But it should be very interesting to see how this class continues to evolve over the next couple of years. So professorpratcher.com, that's where you can follow.
I just also want to say to Dr. Pratcher that I'm very appreciative of the work that he is doing, period. He informs me a lot of the, especially Phoenix Black history, because he is a native of Phoenix. And so I just want to thank Dr. Pratcher because, as he said, when he started this, that Black collections would not be half of what it is without Dr. Pratcher and his continued advocacy for Black history, especially here in Phoenix. So I just want to thank Dr. Pratcher because he is always a wealth of information and a resource to me in order to do this work. So I just wanted to thank you, Anthony, for literally everything. And I always appreciate that you come through for Black collections. So thank you so much. Dr. McAllister, do you have anything you'd like to plug?
Yeah, please call me professor.
Sorry, Professor.
Yeah, I have
Professor.
a master's. Okay, so I feel like I'm going full circle now because when I first started teaching Introduction to African American Studies 11 years ago, I had a tour. We would do a tour of segregated Flagstaff. So that the class would do, and there was an elder in the community that took us on the tour. I was not the expert, right? So we were shown areas in town. I only did that once, so I think I'm going to revisit that and include more research. Because normally what I teach is I start out with Africa, start out with African civilizations, and then I incorporate, looking at slavery through the lens of what Martin Luther King called the 4 interrelated flaws of America, racism, economic exploitation, materialism, and militarism. So, and then bringing everything forward to looking at the present. So what I want to do is we need to develop a Black history of the Southwest.
Yeah. Yes.
That includes Buffalo Soldiers going to the Philippines, right? Because you have a lot of, there's that connection too with Asia. Yeah, I don't know what else to say.
Thank you, Professor McAllister. Appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and close out day 1 of the Black Collection Symposium. We will be doing a day 2 of this symposium. It will be off of Tempe campus, so we will be doing our second day on Saturday, October 19th. I believe today's the 17th. Sorry, days are a little weird for me right now. October 19th, which is a Saturday, at Burton Bar Central Library in downtown Phoenix. So we will be starting our workshop at 10 a.m. on Saturday at Burton Bar. So please come and join us if you are interested. This is an only in-person symposium. The technology and some of the things at Burton Bar are not conducive to technology. So we will only be doing day 2 in person. So if you are interested, if you are available and you have time on Saturday, please come down to Burton Bar. We would love to see you. We will be doing a workshop in the morning, and then we will be doing a panel in the afternoon that speaks about the Black Arizona history and legacy here in Arizona, a continuation again of all of this that we learned today. I want to thank every single panelist who showed up here today. Your contribution, your work, the ability for you to speak about Black history here in Arizona is why I do this symposium, why we as Arizona State University Library are so dedicated to Black collections and the work that every single one of us is doing in the community, because it does matter. I get really emotional about this because this really is something that I pour so much into, and I know that each and every single one of you pour a lot into this as well. So any way that I can assist you, any way that I can highlight the work, the projects, the history of Black Arizona, I want to do that. So if you are interested, please reach out to me. I would love to have a conversation with you about Arizona Black history and how we can preserve that history and why it matters to preserve that history. So again, thank you every single one of you for being here today and on Zoom. I appreciate you, and just in general, please take care. We will see you again, and I look forward to having conversations with each and every single one of you. Oh yes, we do have some leftover food. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm tired. I'm sorry. We will be doing a mixer network